Right, we will go ahead and get started. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yep.
I see the nods. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. It is wonderful to see your familiar faces as always, and to see new people who are joining us today. As you do settle in, I will invite you to please write your name and organization as you would like to be noted for the record. I will also encourage you to keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking so we can have a smooth flowing virtual space. With that, I would like to welcome you to today's Learned Lunch on the effort to shape a successful building performance standards policy in the city of Seattle. And before we do go ahead and get started, we would like to acknowledge that we are all today, wherever we are, on the unceded ancestral land of the Coast Salish people, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Tulalip nations. Land acknowledgement is a traditional custom dating back centuries for many Native communities and nations. And for non-Indigenous communities like ourselves, land acknowledgement is a powerful way of showing respect and honoring the Indigenous people of this land. Once again, welcome to the BPS Learned Lunch. I will quickly provide an overview of our agenda, and we'll pull up the slides again here so you have a sense of what we will cover for our discussion today. So for our agenda, we'll begin with some welcome and context setting, which I will provide briefly. And then you will hear from the city's Office of Sustainability and Environment, where Sandra will go into unpacking some of the building performance standards work that the city will be working on, give us an overview of the process and key considerations. And then she will also talk about how the building performance standards will intersect or interact with the current city regulations. And then we'll also talk about some of the strategic engagement that will be happening with the HDC's Building Performance Standards Task Force that we have, and I will talk about that just briefly. And then we'll also hear about the technical advisory group that the city will be putting together, and also get a sense of the overall public engagement around the building performance standards work. And then after that, Steve will come in, Steve Gelb at the Emerald Cities, to talk about what this potentially would cost as we are doing this analysis, what requirements should be potentially considered, what exemptions should be there, and what support is needed in this work. And then we'll conclude with discussions and questions from all of you, and we'll encourage folks to post your questions in the chat as we go through the Learned Lunch today. So a little bit of background before I go here into this process timeline. Last year, in the last quarter, the former mayor, now former mayor Durkan, issued an executive order directing the city's Office of Sustainability and the Environment to implement a new carbon-based building performance standards policy in 2022. That is for large buildings that are 20,000 feet and above. This, as you know, presents a great opportunity to really improve the efficiency and safety of our multifamily affordable housing buildings. but it also can bring additional cost and challenges. And the mayor acknowledged that in putting out the executive order and was really intentional in having the department work closely in partnership with the affordable housing stakeholders, as we've always done, in shaping a policy that can both support some of the upfront cost and also support the implementation for the affordable housing sector. In the same timeline, HDC received a grant from the Energy Foundation to work with the city in shaping the policy recommendations for the building performance standards policy in order for it to be successful. The recommendations will proactively really shape in offering solutions to some of the challenges that we all are aware of around the technical challenges, the financial challenges, or the operational challenges that could show up for subsidized housing, building owners, and sometimes in transferring some of the costs to tenants. So really wanting to be proactive in offering those solutions and ensuring that the process is being informed by these recommendations that can get us to a place where we are lowering the upfront cost and the operating cost for affordable housing, while enabling our sector to really address the climate crisis and improve the resiliency of our sector in operating and maintaining housing for people who are low income. And through that grant, we established work with a building performance standards task force to support the project. And I have before you here on the screen an overview of the work that is entailed within that project over the next 6 months to June. In November, we launched the first task force meeting with a number of you who are here today, and we'll be hoping that some of you can chime in with some of the conversations that you've already had. We've broken down the project into 3 phases. So phase 1 is the first part here where the task force was convened. And then we're also doing some review of the sector goals and existing data on BPS standards and doing the portfolio analysis earlier on. As part of that portfolio analysis and building typology review, we are also looking at the capital needs assessment and wanting to ensure that we're integrating the financing in our effort, because that will be a critical area that really identifies some of the capital resources necessary to implement the retrofits ultimately. So that work is underway, and end of January this year is when we anticipate to have concluded some of the early phases, and Steve will touch on some of what is being done on that front. And then the second phase of the work is the actual audits. Throughout this time, throughout the first phase, we'll be identifying some of the targeted buildings for a level 1 audit. And then in phase 2, which begins in February, we will actually have the level 1 audits that will be conducted by our partners at O'Brien 360 to really get us to a place where we have enough data that associates some of the retrofit costs and extrapolates it to the affordable multifamily buildings for us to have a full picture of what's entailed there. Within that second phase, we also intend to provide feedback to the city in helping them draft the building performance standards policy. And that's why it's important for us here to convene and let you know of the opportunities to really shape this work and provide your own input and feedback as well. Phase 3 is going to be taking a lot of that data that would have come out of the audits and the analysis to really develop a decision tree and key policy recommendations to the city. And we do intend throughout the process to engage you as HDC members and engage the broader HDC membership as well throughout the process, and letting you know of the work where it is now and how you can be a key part of shaping it. So that brings me to the emphasis on how you can provide input if you are not already in the Building Performance Standards Task Force. Please feel free to email me, patience@housingconsortium.org, And we'll encourage you to also reach out to Bambi, who's here with us, who's our project manager and really been a key pillar of support for this project. We also call on you if you don't have the capacity to provide the detailed input via email. Please encourage some of the folks on your teams who are relevant to this work to be engaged in connecting with myself or connecting with the Building Performance Standards Task Force to really ensure you do have that opportunity to provide feedback. And then we'll continue to provide platforms for this kind of engagement. With that, I do want to turn us over to hear a little bit more on what the Building Performance Standards policies actually are and why they are important. And as I introduce the next speaker here, I will emphasize that most of our buildings that are here today are going to be there for the next decades. We've done some work on new buildings and made sure that we have code for new buildings, but we do want to emphasize the importance of finding ways to unlock some of the terrible climate impacts in existing buildings. And this is one way that we can do that. And I'm glad that we have key experts who can really support this work. And Sandra Mallory from the City of Seattle's Office of Sustainability and Environment is that key partner. And Sandra, please take it away.
All right, just a moment. Okay, hello there. Let me share my screen. And put this into presentation. Okay, is that showing up for folks in presentation mode? Great. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Patience, and for the framing. I am here. I want to talk to you, give you some background around why the city is pursuing a policy to improve existing buildings, give you a little bit of an overview of what we mean when we talk about carbon-based performance standards, and what our process will be for policy and program development. And apologies to folks on the task force who've already heard some of this information, but I'm really thankful to have both the task force and then the larger housing development consortium community to help inform our process as we move forward. So I want to start, if I can move my slides. There we go. I want to start by sharing a case study that we did with the Seattle Housing Authority. This is Stewart Manor, and we worked with the Seattle Housing Authority and some engineering consultants to scope a resilient retrofit for this building. So, you know, in considering how we are going to transition all of our existing buildings off of fossil fuels and make them resilient and energy efficient, we wanted to look specifically at affordable housing case study in what this means. So we're interested in questions about, you know, what are the opportunities for energy and utility savings? How deep will those savings be? How can we basically transition this building off of fossil fuels? What are the climate pollution reduction impacts? How can we support better health for the building occupants? What are the pathways that are going to minimize tenant disruption? And of course, what will it cost? And a huge thanks to Bobby Coleman and his team at SHA for providing access to the building, engaging in the process to make sure it represented a realistic approach for that building. And then also a huge thanks to Office of Housing, who was also integral in reviewing the case study and the evaluation to make sure that it fit with what they knew about how this could work. So couple of key strategies that were identified in this case study that could be implemented kind of all at once or in phases. One, replace the existing gas hot water heater with electric heat pump water heating, which removes the only fossil fuel use in this particular building and then gives you about a 13% energy reduction. You know, the next strategy was to install heat recovery ventilation in the corridors. that improves the indoor air quality and gets even greater energy efficiency. That measure alone is about a 20% energy savings. And then a measure which has very little energy, overall energy impact, was to replace the electric resistance heat in the community room with a heat pump. So not great, sort of one room, one large room, so not big overall energy savings, but it provides cooling. So it's extremely costly in this building to go through, and also very intrusive to retrofit the heating system for all of the units. But by putting cooling in the community area, then residents have access on site to cooling during extreme heat or smoke events. And then lastly, roof insulation, which could be done to create some more energy efficiency savings and utility cost reduction, but can be done when that roof is being replaced. And just point out that we are not actually, we looked at measures on the envelope on the walls, but not wanting to have the tenant disruption of having to move tenants out of the building and back in. Those are identified in a larger study, but they're not really the focus of what we imagine would happen in this building. And so as I continue with this presentation about how we're developing policy for performance standards for existing buildings, I just point out this case study about this is what we mean. This is what we're trying to get at, which is how do we upgrade our buildings to improve health, reduce operating costs, improve long-term viability and resilience. And, by the way, let's also make sure that we are addressing climate change and helping with each individual building to mitigate climate change. And with that, I just want to point out that we think of, at the city, we think of this transition off of fossil fuels in our buildings and transportation as really an environmental justice issue. In the big picture, we know that climate change has a disproportionate impact on lower income communities and people of color. And we also know that all along the pathway of extracting, transporting, and using fossil fuels, there are health impacts. And so just that's a real key priority for the city. And, our framing for the work that we're doing at the Office of Sustainability is both, reducing emissions. We want to mitigate climate change. We think that is really important. And we have, specific targets identified for emissions reduction in the building sector that are identified in our climate action plan. And, those who have been following the Green New Deal work in the city of Seattle, we want to sort of embody the goals and the priorities of the Green New Deal in all of the work that we're doing. And, make sure that we are prioritizing our investments in those communities that tend to be underserved, historically most harmed by economic and racial and environmental injustices. So with that framing, patients did, noted that the previous mayor, Mayor Durkan, while she was in Glasgow at the climate summit, released an executive order. And one of the key components of that was for the city to develop carbon-based performance standards for existing commercial and multifamily buildings. At the same time, we are leading with our own facilities. And so we're busy doing an electrification strategy to get us off of fossil fuels for our own city-owned buildings. In that executive order, the mayor also was very clear that as we improve the performance of existing buildings, this is, again, it's an environmental justice approach, sort of using the goals of the Green New Deal. And we want, one of the goal is to create healthier living and working spaces. And we want to do that in ways that minimize displacement risk, that create, make sure that we alleviate the cost impacts for those who can't bear the cost, and make sure that we use this as an opportunity for inclusive workforce development. And if you could, I'm gonna, let's see, hold on, there we go. Sorry. Okay, there we go. So I wanna then talk about just a little bit of background about the policies that already exist for existing buildings. And in the city, like I mentioned, we're working on our own city-owned buildings. There is the updated energy code has some limitations on fossil fuel equipment, fossil fuel and electric resistance equipment for commercial and larger multifamily buildings. And this applies in multifamily buildings when that equipment is being replaced. Okay. And if you'll hold on just one moment. Hey, Pirate. Sorry, background noise, working at home. So the other policies we have are energy benchmarking. So for commercial and multifamily buildings, and those buildings 20,000 square feet or larger. And that's just really reporting the energy use every year to the city of Seattle and understanding how buildings are performing. And then we have a building tune-ups policy for existing larger commercial buildings. Within that landscape, there's also the state of Washington now has an energy performance standard for existing commercial buildings. And that is going to be an important consideration as we continue with our policy development and how we integrate with that particular policy. And I just want to point out that the mandate applies to larger commercial buildings, but there are early adopter incentives available, and those are available to multifamily buildings as well. So those policies that are already in place for existing buildings are important, and in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of making sure our buildings are performing well, and they give us some good emission savings if we strictly look at greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but they're not sufficient. The top line on this chart is business as usual. What we do if we don't, what happens without any policies. And you can see, the energy code is going to help us reduce our emissions. Building tune-ups help us reduce emissions, and then energy performance standards that the state is putting in place will also do that. But it's important and insufficient, I should say. So in Seattle, the performance standards, carbon-based performance standards we're talking about would apply to commercial and multifamily buildings. And this is just a screenshot from our data visualization site from our benchmarking. And just gives you an idea that most of these larger buildings are concentrated downtown and the surrounding areas, with others in the urban villages. And what we're talking about is really targeting, again, targeting the fossil fuels in our buildings and transitioning at the same time that we're improving efficiency, transitioning the buildings off of fossil fuels, because that's the biggest greenhouse gas emissions reduction and climate mitigation impact we can have. And on this chart, what you can see is that, the bottom area there, the policy, a Seattle Building Performance Standards policy, would give us over 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So just kind of thinking back to the case study at the very beginning, the goal of this work is not regulation per se. The goal of this work is to, like I said, improve our existing building stock, make it more resilient, reduce energy costs, and climate mitigation. And we recognize that there are strong concerns by not just affordable housing, but any building owner about how this policy would roll out, and some of the cost impacts and impacts on tenants and how this work can be done. So priorities for this policy are that we're looking at equity as a key lens, climate mitigation, health and resilience, that the process that we use to develop the policy is inclusive, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, and that what we're developing is not just a legislation, but a an overall policy and package of work to help all of us transition our buildings. And this year we actually have some funding to launch a Clean Buildings Retrofit Accelerator, and that we look to as a seed work for scaling up a larger support program for this work. And just, very briefly, again, what we're trying to do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we want the policy, we're working on even though, our goal is X% emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050, we need a policy in place so owners understand where we're headed and can work this into sort of longer term asset management cycles. And, whatever we do will be phased in over time by building size, type, equity considerations, what buildings does it make, which buildings should go first and which buildings are going to need more time. And then being very careful that we know there's a concern about, regulation on top of regulation. So how can we coordinate this work with other existing policies, especially the state's energy performance standards? So the sort of long-term pathway for how this will roll out, Patience mentioned the executive order where we are directed to bring a draft policy proposal to the mayor's office on July 1st. But that's going to be part of a longer term process. So, this work that we're doing now, very intense stakeholder engagement, working on a policy package, that will then go to the mayor's office. It will go through the legislative process with council. We don't know exactly the timing of that at this point. And once that's done, there will still be rulemaking, refinement, and program development until, the first actual compliance cycle might hit in 2026, consistent with the state's cycle. And at the bottom, also just calling out that this is, like I said, it's not just a regulation we're interested in. It's not really what we're interested in, honestly, but also what is the program that helps move buildings towards greater efficiency and off of fossil fuels, and how can we support building owners, especially under-resourced building owners. So part of that process, Patience also mentioned, we've got a number of different ways that we are framing the opportunity to get input and have people help us to shape this policy. So we are establishing a technical advisory group, which is, building owners, building energy professionals primarily. And that will probably go a little deeper into the weeds about specific greenhouse gas impacts and energy use intensity targets. There is this task force, and we have the HTC Affordable Housing Study and Task Force, and there's some overlap between that and the technical advisory group. We will have public open houses, which are more all-inclusive, and we'll be reaching out, sort of have more dedicated outreach to under-resourced building owners who often we're finding don't have the capacity to participate in some of these bigger processes. So we'll be wanting to make sure that we connect with them directly. And then also really trying to reach out to tenants and understand how this policy might impact tenants, what their concerns are for improving their having buildings improved. And, we actually have some work that we're doing starting with our Department of Neighborhoods and their community liaisons to engage with community in that way. Also working with labor, how can we make sure that this is a policy that provides inclusive workforce development and addresses, we're going to need a lot of folks to help us implement this policy, and how can we make sure that we're prepared for that. So with that, I'm just going to end. We do have, there's more information on our web pages that you can find at seattle.gov. And we have a dedicated email set aside for comments and input and questions. And we really, I think we look to this as like the first of our series of engagement with the affordable housing community, and hope to continue to chat with you as we move forward. And so I'm going to pause and unshare, and then hopefully I think there might be time for a few questions and discussion before we move on to Steve. Let's see. All right.
Sandra, I have a question, and this may or may not be the right context for it, but one thing I've heard, so you provide some good sort of rationales for why we want to move off fossil fuels. Another thing that I've heard is that over time, we may find that buildings that are still using gas become sort of like fuel islands where either the cost of fossil fuels would increase as the amount of users decline, but the fixed costs remain the same, or there's just sort of less resources available to service those. I'm just curious if you feel like, is there research to back that up, or sort of what is that just kind of a theory, or is there some data to support sort of that concern in the, that could happen over the long term, and over what time period might that happen? So if that's too detailed for this point, I'm happy to table that, but that's just something I've been interested in learning more about.
Yeah, it's a great question. I am not personally aware of great research on it. I think it's more speculation. If we consider that, if we assume, which is where the state is headed and where we're headed, that we are going to transition, buildings and transportation off of fossil fuels, then you would imagine that the cost of that fuel is going to go up as there are fewer customers using those resources, right? So somehow what's left still has to be paid for, and it's going to be borne by the fewer number of customers. So I think, and someone else may have, other research that they can share, but it's just a conceptually, if we do this, and I would say the time frame is somewhat unknown. We really are trying to, accelerate our response and, get to like a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030. So that's a lot. I don't know though, in utility world, how quickly that would impact prices and islanding of resources. But the other thing I think about as we develop, policies at the city, one of the things that often happens is we don't want to burden, those who don't have the resources, which is important. And I think then the first reaction is to say, let's exempt those buildings from a regulation. But that could put them in the position where, they're the last ones left standing. And so the way we're trying to think about this is, how can we sort of transition the harder to transition buildings, whether by regulation or voluntarily or however we do it? How can we address that first? And, make sure that even if we don't know exactly what's going to happen in 20, 30 years, that we're prepared. And, as Jen and I actually have been communicating back and forth about Department of Energy grant opportunities, right? And so let's focus on subsidized affordable housing as a good way to use potentially available funds and, model how this could happen and make sure that we're working on, the buildings that are going to need the greatest support first.
Sandra, I have a couple things to add. First of all, one of the things I think governments and communities are wrestling with is, can we shut down part of the infrastructure of the fossil fuel systems? If we do that, we have less fixed costs and we mitigate cost increases. So Europe is doing that. They're just taking whole neighborhoods and shutting it down. So that would mitigate some of those increases. The other thing is there's potential that electric rates can go down, because just as we're bringing more customers onto an existing infrastructure we have for electricity, so potentially that can make Seattle City Light and its distribution more efficient. So those two things are playing also. But it is speculation, as Sandra said, because it's just now starting to happen in a few places.
Yeah, thanks for those, Steve.
Thank you, that's helpful.
I would also add that the equity component that you emphasized, Sandra, also means that you start off focusing on some of the communities that will be hardest to transition. And I think it touches on some of the potential speculation of what it would mean for low-income households if that's not being led with earlier on in supporting multifamily building housing that is subsidized. But I wanted to clarify a question from you, Sandra, on the building threshold for this building performance standards policy. At the local level, you're considering a 20,000 feet plus, and I think my understanding is that the state Clean Buildings Act is at 50,000 plus, but there's legislation this session that is working on expanding that threshold to include the 20,000 square feet buildings. And I wonder if you see that as an opportunity to both align with this work at local level and also increase potentially some resource support for implementation.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So the current state mandate is for commercial buildings over 50,000 square feet. And then now they are coming there's legislation to extend that to both to smaller commercial buildings, 20,000 square feet and above, or over 20,000. And to extend it to multifamily. What we're looking to do in the legislation and the policy pathway we put forward is to include all commercial multifamily buildings over 20,000 square feet. Those are the buildings that, and to do that, which doesn't mean that everything has to happen starting in 2026. It just means that we address it together as a package in terms of how that is going to play out, instead of one policy starting, addressing larger commercial buildings now and then coming back 5 years later and doing it. So let's sort of look at the big picture of all of these buildings. It's also that set of landscape of buildings are the buildings that are benchmarking. So those are buildings for which owners are already reporting their energy use and greenhouse gas emissions to the city of Seattle. We have that data. So we feel that's there are a lot of smaller buildings that we will also have to transition, but a performance standard may not be the most appropriate approach if they haven't already been tracking how they're using energy and how their buildings have been performing. So that's, part of the cutoff there in terms of the size. Does that answer your question?
A quick clarification. I think the current state legislation as it stands will only require benchmarking and energy plans for multifamily buildings. Will not at this point, at this time, require building performance standards, but we're probably headed that way. And I think interestingly, the data Sandra shared with you is there was just as many multifamily buildings, large multifamily, as there are commercial. So if we're going to truly hit our climate goals, we really can't omit multifamily buildings.
Yeah, and I will say that and I don't, we're compiling, what I showed you is just the tip of the iceberg of some of the information we're compiling about, the buildings that would be impacted, who they are, which you have gas, and, multifamily buildings tend to have a smaller greenhouse gas emissions impact. They tend to have fewer gas appliances and equipment. But again, kind of to this point of like, well, okay, yes, but we want to make sure we don't leave that group of buildings stranded. We kind of look comprehensively at all of them.
Well, thank you, Sandra, for that comprehensive presentation and for taking all these questions. If there are no further questions for Sandra, we will transition over to the next part of the agenda here to hear from Steve Gelb at Emerald Cities, who has been doing this work for a long time, looking at ways that we can retrofit our existing buildings, but also has most recently been dedicating a lot of time looking at what this potentially will cost as a policy, what requirements should be considered, what exemptions should exist, if any, and what support is needed to set us up as a sector for success. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Steve, to take it away from here.
Thank you. Well, I have mostly a list of a lot of questions, and I have 2 answers, and the rest are questions, and I want to know also here if you have more questions. So the big picture is, what does this mean to your organization and the buildings you own, and why should you engage? And I have answers to those questions. It's going to mean a lot to your organization, and it's potentially going to impact, certainly going to impact all of your large buildings. And, some buildings, I want to emphasize, will qualify today for the standard and nothing will need to be done. But probably most of the buildings will have to address the policy in some way. And you need to engage because there are a lot of questions out there. And I think the Office of Sustainability is giving an opportunity for the affordable housing community to weigh in and say, what do we need? How should the policy be constructed so that it's fair, so that it fits into the needs of affordable housing community, so that the timing works, and so on. So what I've listed here are just some of the questions that our task force and planners have identified so far. I'm gonna kind of walk through them. And the goal over the next 6 months really is to answer these questions the best we can. And to the extent that some of them and many of them might create some challenges for affordable housing, what advice do we have for the Office of Sustainability to craft a policy that mitigates those impacts? Because as Sandra mentioned, there is an emphasis on equity, and the city knows we have a shortage of housing. So the goal here is not to burden housing, but to mesh with those needs. So the first area, it will be looking at and questioning is just scope and costs. So we're looking at what exactly needs to be done in buildings. The first step in many buildings, as Sandra mentioned, will be electrification. With new technologies, electrification also generally comes efficiency. So when you replace gas or old electric equipment with new heat pump equipment, you reduce the energy use. So to comply with an energy standard and an emission standard, those measures will deal with both in many cases. When will the changes need to happen? We'll be looking at, do they happen at, when equipment is ready to be replaced? Do they have to happen before that? Are they coordinated with other changes? Certainly cost is a big issue. And we're trying to really explore all the issues around cost, not just what does it take to install a heat pump, but do I need to upgrade the electrical panel? Do we need to replace electrical systems in order to comply? Are we shifting the burden of paying for utilities from tenants to the building owner? So we'll be looking at all components of costs. How is it paid for? So that is, are there, does come out of housing funds? Are there financing opportunities, lending opportunities that help? Are there tax credits? All of those tools that you all use in building and maintaining your buildings today, and what other tools do we need to bring to the table? And then are there savings to expect? So if with increased efficiency, with changing rates, some of these measures will reduce your costs or cost to your tenants. So how do we capture those and how do we account for those? There are questions around utilities. We discussed earlier what happens to gas and electric rates. To the best we can guess, what would the impacts be without these policies? What will the impacts be with them? And what, if any, policy measures need to be addressed in that regard. We'll look a little bit at steam buildings. There are steam buildings out there, and how will those be addressed? Looks like Robin has a question. I can go for that right now, Robin.
Oh, if you don't mind, just before you move away from that second column on utilities. So while that fits into a nice blue box, that is an enormous question, both in terms of crystal ball for rates. But if this, for example, were implemented today, and many, many affordable housing buildings have tenants paying their own electricity. So if you convert then from gas to electric, right? Whether that ends up on a building's meter so that the owner is paying for heat, for example, which we normally don't do when we've got like cove heaters for heat in the units. This upends the utility allowance calculated that's a give back to tenants. And it really upends, frankly, I think in a significant way, the operating cost, and rent levels, at least recently, have not increased by what I would imagine the increases may be in the operating costs, because gas still, maybe falsely, but gas still is so economical compared to electricity rates today. And so I really respect how thoughtful this all is. And I think this particular box has a lot to do with the long-term sustainability of operations of many, many affordable buildings. So thanks, Steve.
Yep. Thank you for raising that. Yeah, utility allowances are a good question. One of the questions we'll be asking is, if a building is already electric and has electric cove heaters and is reasonably efficient, there may be no changes to the heating system and may not impact tenants. If I think you're going to have, in most buildings, I think you're going to have still hybrid systems where we've gone to gas for something and electric for something else in terms of the utilities. Now, the change in the energy code is making, I don't see this as a problem as much for things being built past the new energy code that was implemented this past fall. But I think we've got a lot of catch up to do. And I think you're going to find mixed systems. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Great. I'll move on, and please interrupt if you have other questions. That's great feedback. Touched a little bit on incentives. So what incentives are needed and where and how? Is it upfront costs? Is it ongoing costs of operating costs, as we just talked about a little bit? And then the city, if there are incentives needed, the city's going to have to wrestle, where do those come from? Can the utility help out? Is there other funding to support this? And then,
Steve, can I interrupt? I'm sorry, I should have raised my hand, but I just want to make sure I understand the term incentives here, because an incentive would incentivize someone to do something that they were not otherwise required to do, right? Like to go above and beyond what code might require. Is that quite what you mean here? Or are we talking about ways to sort of financially support what is actually going to be a requirement in code? Can you just talk a little bit more about that? Thank you.
yeah, you're absolutely correct. Incentive is probably the wrong word. So this is probably funding or support funding here. Yeah, the city may be interested in incentives to incent people to do things earlier, but yeah, my intent here was to say, if some of these policies will be a financial burden to affordable housing, which will limit the ability to install certain measures and impact the ability to maintain the housing to do what y'all are trying to do, then what are those needs and when do they occur and how big are they? And we probably don't need to identify where that money will come from, but will certainly raise to the Office of Sustainability that that it is a burden and what kind of funding supports may be needed. And I see, I hope that helps, Jen. And I hope Ariel has a question also, I see.
Yeah, I was just wondering similarly what you guys meant by housing owners. I would think with the large buildings that you guys are talking about, you're talking about developers.
So we are focused on the affordable housing sector with this
Sure.
work.
So
we're really talking about mostly nonprofit owners, the housing authority, and some for-profit owners of affordable housing.
okay, so the affordable housing groups. Okay, thank you.
But the city, I think, is interested in taking some of what we learn and uncover and applying it to quote market rate affordable housing or naturally occurring affordable housing in particular.
So then you're thinking about also developers when thinking about these policies
I think
that might potentially
the Office
consider
of
affordable.
Sustainability will be thinking about that. I think we are less focused on it in the work we're doing.
Okay,
Sandra,
thank
you
you.
want to comment on that?
I'll just say that Steve is absolutely right. The process, this HDC process, we really look to sort of learning from subsidized affordable housing, what the constraints are. Some of that will transfer to other types of multifamily housing, where rents tend to be lower. Steve mentioned the naturally occurring affordable housing. We're less interested in we're interested in the people who are long-term owners, as opposed to folks who are developing a building and then selling it. And, the development of new construction is covered by the energy code.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of my question. I'm relatively new to affordable housing in the Seattle area. I've done some in Kitsap County, and a lot of the incentives there are to encourage affordable housing within, standard rate housing. And so those buildings are sometimes combined, or those units are sometimes within those buildings. Does that occur in Seattle? Sorry that I don't know that in advance, but.
Can I just chime in? This is Jen. I'm with the Office of Housing. It's nice to meet you. And yes, we do have those programs that provide sort of an incentive, or even some that are required as part of the land use code that have income and rent restricted units as part of a market rate property. But the focus of what we're talking about here is really on nonprofit or housing authority owned housing, that has public funding in it and is subject to a long-term regulatory agreement. So kind of a different
Okay,
different
so
animal.
The designated affordable housing, not necessarily these kind of market rate with some mixed in affordable units.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great. So quickly, so the other thing we're looking at some of the rules and regulations. Affordable housing tends to be more densely populated per square foot than other multifamily housing. So is EUI a good measure? Any adjustments need to be made to account for that density? What is the timing of compliance? And are we considering at time of equipment failure, at time of financing? And how does that tie into the city's goals of greenhouse gas reductions? And should any buildings be exempt, as Sandra mentioned? So, there are some 100-year-old gas boiler heated buildings where perhaps the cost of upgrading is so expensive that mitigating the operating costs over time and maintaining gas or steam infrastructure may be the best course of action. So we'll be exploring that as well. And finally, how does this get implemented within organizations that within affordable housing organizations? Who plans, implements, and tracks performance in the organization and outside? This and what burden does that put, if there is a burden? And on the positive side, how can that be used to improve performance and to reduce costs and to improve health and safety and comfort of residents? So there's a whole operating side of this as well that we will consider. And finally, and this could fit anywhere, is, we talked a little bit about the timing and how does this mesh with re-syndications and tax credits and that sort of thing. So if there's a timing in affordable housing that is best to wait until a refinance, is that possible? And how does that get built into the policy to mitigate some of the financial impacts? So these are some of the questions that we're asking. I'd love to hear if anyone else has additional questions, but really what I want to leave you all with is, we have a nice group of folks on board, but this is going to affect every building, or every owner certainly of affordable housing in the city, and really ask that you all spread the word. And I think some of you highlighted that there will be, there are challenges here, and this is a sort of this opportunity to address them in the policy making, and that's an amazing opportunity. But we need your engagement and engagement of your colleagues at in engineering firms, architecture firms, building owners, managers, etc. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, Steve. Any questions for Steve? James, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. First, I just want to say I really appreciate the work that the city's been doing on this issue. I'm proud to live and work in a city that's as focused on climate issues as Seattle is. I am curious if, as we start to answer some of the questions on that last slide, there will be any analysis into what the potential local housing cost impacts might mean for shifting future population growth to communities with a worse carbon profile than the city of Seattle. I'm thinking Renton or South Carolina.
That I don't know how to respond to, because that is a much larger economic question, but it's an interesting one. The only thing I will say is that there's always a fear that as we make our own little bubble of Seattle more climate friendly, that people will leave and businesses will leave, and that has not really proven to be the case to date in terms of, we are still a growing city with growing economic activity, and our emissions went up. Our building related emissions went up 8% from 2016 to 2018 because of new construction and new economic activity. So you're absolutely right. It's the big picture. And I think in some ways, part of what we like to pride ourselves on in Seattle is that we're a leader. And if we can do it here, then it shows the way for other communities. And so, our hope is not that it only happens in Seattle and nowhere else, but this is sort of, and with our carbon neutral electricity, if we can't do it here, we kind of can't do it anywhere. So it's sort of like, if we can do this and show the way, then hopefully this is an impact throughout, the world, if you will. Not that Seattle leads the world, but just, you have to start where you are and make those changes where you are and hope that others can also find ways to do that.
Yeah, I would just add, last year Seattle passed some new energy codes, and that was the kind of question that was raised. Since then, City of Shoreline followed Seattle's code. King County is proposing follow Seattle's code, and now the state potentially will follow Seattle's code. So I think Sandra is perfectly right. Seattle has an opportunity to lead the way, and hopefully other jurisdictions will follow.
Thank you, Steve. I just see Robin, you have your hand up.
Yes, I was wondering if anyone on the call remembers the rollout of the mandate to reinforce masonry buildings. I don't know if any of you were in affordable housing that many years ago. It's not all that long ago, but in a similar initiative, due to some pretty pressing concerns about seismic impacts, there was a huge list made of all of the unreinforced masonry buildings, and the city was very, very eager to create incentives that those get enforced or reinforced. And I don't know if that proved to be successful. It's very different than this, because you've got new seismic codes supporting new construction not to be weak, just like we've got the new energy code that's for new buildings going to make a huge improvement. But the URM initiative was a backward look of what have we got. And so I don't know if that was successful or not, or if there's any guidance there for if it wasn't, why not, that might give insight into the kinds of incentives that could be rolled out and give us a chance for success, Steve, in your initiative here.
Yeah, I think you raise a great point. These are expensive sort of mandates that, I think the difference here is we're responding to a critical future need in climate, but we also have short-term benefits that come with these improvements.
Steve, this is Marty. I was going to say I can actually speak a little on the URM. I would not use it as a model for what we're doing here. In a lot of ways, I would call it a big failure because there's an incentive or a desire to do this work, but it affects a limited number of buildings and only those buildings, whereas this affects the city, the region, the state, everything. I think there's a much better push to do the climate work than there ever was to do the URM work. The URM work, we are still waiting to figure out how it'll be paid for. That is still the big question that lays out there. We at one point in time we were told it was going to be rolled out and required, and every single time it's been, well, never mind, because we don't have a funding source. So I don't know that you can compare the two. I think they're too significantly different.
Thanks, Marty, for that update. I wasn't aware of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty, and thank you, Steve, for your presentation. I do want to emphasize one thing that Steve mentioned, which is the potential impact that the policy will have on all of our multifamily buildings. And we do encourage, especially all of you as HDC members, to really engage in tackling these questions, because there are really big questions around the cost, the challenges that are before us, the resources necessary to ensure successful implementation, the timing of doing that, whether that's aligned with some of the refinancing or resyndication processes. So there's a lot of subject matter expertise from all of you as the membership that can really help drive and shape this work. And we look forward to continue to partner with you, working through the Building Performance Standards Task Force, but also inviting all of you to share your input as well throughout the process. So we've come to the top end of the hour here. I will close off by thanking all of you for your commitment in this region to ensure that as the built environment, we are also contributing effectively in building a sustainable future for everyone, not just the low-income households, but for across the region. And ultimately, as was emphasized earlier, a lot of these policies are often used as a model elsewhere, and we've seen that with the energy code work that was done. So with that, we will close this off and look forward to continuing to partner with you. Thank you, Steve and Sandra, for joining us and presenting today.
Thank you, everyone.